Welcome to all our online guests, and especially everyone from the Fredericton Nature Club. And welcome to everyone here at the Little Schoolhouse in Miramichi. Tonight, our presentation is a peek at the Lichens and Lichenicolous fungi of New Brunswick. And our presenter is Kendra Driscoll. We're really happy to have her here tonight, and a big thank you to Kendra for presenting to us tonight. Kendra is a curatorial assistant in the Natural History Department of the New Brunswick Museum. She looks after the day-to-day management of the botany and mycology collection and takes care of the museum's 135,000 approximately specimens of algae, bryophytes, fungi, lichens, and vascular plants. She's been studying lichens for almost 19 years and identified her first Lichenicolous fungus in the fall of 2007. Among other research projects, she's leading a collaborative effort to create an annotated checklist and identification resource for the Lichenicolous fungi, now known to occur in Atlantic Canada and surrounding areas. So welcome, Kendra, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Pam. Just going to find my presentation here. Okay, can everybody see that?
We can see it, but the audio is not what I would like. It's not your fault.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've just improved it.
Okay, perfect. Just shout out if it kicks out again. I'm not used to this headset. So before I jump right in, I just wanted to take a minute to respectfully acknowledge that New Brunswick is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Beskwatamakati peoples, and that we seek to repair and rebuild meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples and honor these lands, which hold the hopes of future generations.
Is that an audio problem?
Okay. Sorry about that.
Not your fault, my fault. You can't see me. This is red.
So when Pam approached me about giving this talk, we talked about a few different options that we could go with. We could focus on sort of a treasure hunt for really common lichens, or I could jump right into some of my research on more obscure branch of Lichenicolous fungi. And what we settled on was kind of an overview of a bunch of different things, kind of a peek at different stuff. And for anyone who's wondering about this very goofy picture that I chose to put on the front of this, I noticed on your website that the Miramichi Nature Club has a stewardship role for the Kennedy Lakes Protected Natural Area, which is where this picture was taken. You might recognize this lichen as lungwort. It's one of the more popular lichens for people to kind of capture their imagination, I think. And it's pretty common in our province, but also very sensitive to air pollution. But I was looking for it specifically trying to find these little black spots. I'm always looking at this lichen out in the field, and for over a decade, I hadn't been able to find this particular fungus growing on it, and I knew that it should be in New Brunswick, but I'd never seen it in any of our forests until one day, walking on this beautiful hillside in Kennedy Lakes Protected Natural Area, it jumped out at me from several meters away. And I was so excited to see it that I had to take a break from my work to take a rare selfie just to capture the moment of my excitement for finding this very obscure thing. So this is the kind of nerdery that you're going to be dealing with tonight, and hope some of my enthusiasm for these things can wear off on you. Okay. So I'm going to break things down into a few sections, just to start out with and get everyone on the same page. I'll give a brief introduction to lichens, just kind of definitions, features, general biology, sort of what a lichen is, where a lichen is, and what a lichen looks like and what it does. And then I'll cover, some tidbits of different lichens you could find in New Brunswick, how you would go about doing that if it's a hobby you want to kind of take up. And we'll just look at some pictures of common species and the features that identify them, as well as some threatened species that it would be really great to be on the lookout for. And then I do want to take some time to talk about kind of my pet project, looking at Lichenicolous fungi. And if lichens are an unusual sort of a topic to delve into. Then Lichenicolous fungi are that much more obscure and unpopular, but I think no less fascinating and no less beautiful. So let's jump in. In a nutshell, a lichen is not a plant, which is what some people think. They tend to occur with mosses and other bryophytes, which are small, non-vascular plants, but that's not what a lichen is. A lichen is strictly a symbiotic organism. And there's a lot of research happening on how many different partners might be involved in this. But at a minimum, a lichen includes one type of fungus and one symbiotic organism that live together and create something new. So some people would refer to this as kind of a marriage. Some people refer to it as fungus learning to farm. And I don't know that it's necessarily either of those things, but what it does create is something very unique. I like to think of it as the fungi giving kind of a cozy home to little algae that in turn feed the fungus, and that it's kind of like a fungus that's learned to live like a plant that can grow just about anywhere. In these rough schematics here, you don't need to worry about the terminology unless you're really going to get into lichens, and then there are books for that can help you. But what I want you to take away from this is that if you were to cut through a standard lichen, you would see something kind of like this, either a top and a bottom, a middle, and some algae in between, or for some of the more three-dimensional ones, you'd see something like this. And what I want you to take away from this schematic is that most of these layers are specialized fungal tissue. So it's the fungus or the mycobiont that produces kind of that overall structure. And then somewhere near the surface, either the upper surface, if it's sort of a flat leafy lichen, or around the outer rim near the outside where it can get at the light, you'd have a layer of either green algae or cyanobacteria, some kind of photosynthetic microbe, or a little bit of both. And that together they create something stronger. So this has a few implications for lichen lifestyle. The first thing is, unlike, say, a wood rotting fungus, lichenized fungi do not need to eat their home. So a lot of people will ask me if the lichens that they see on their favorite tree out front of their house are going to damage that tree, what they should do to remove them. There's no need to remove them. They're not hurting the tree. They're just living there. They use the tree sort of as a scaffolding to get to where the light is and where the right conditions where they want to live. The other way in which lichens are not quite like plants is that they don't have any need for a root system. So there are some little structures on a lot of lichens that appear kind of like a root, but they're there for attachment. As far as bringing in water or trace minerals, a lichen can do that through any part of its body. It doesn't need to, it can absorb water directly from the air or from the rain. It doesn't need to suck it up through its roots, its rhizines, like a straw. So it's not like a plant in that way. And because it's got this at least 2-part, sometimes 3-part lifestyle where it has these individual pieces that, taxonomically are not related to each other. You're talking about 2 different kingdoms of organisms have come together to make something new, a fungus and an algae or a cyanobacteria. Lichens have come up with a couple of different strategies for dealing with this. So one strategy, and what you could see as sort of a more traditional way of reproducing, would be to just do kind of what a mushroom does, to use typical sexual reproduction, produce a fungal fruiting structure, usually an apothecium for lichens, but something that holds fungal spores and shoots them out into the environment. The disadvantage of that approach for a lichen in particular is that not only does the spore have to find somewhere good to land where it can germinate, where the conditions are appropriate for it to grow and produce a lichen and thrive and do its thing, but it also has to find the right kind of photosynthetic partner before it can begin to live. So to remove that level of serendipity, a lot of lichens have sort of a vegetative reproductive structure, and they've produced all kinds of specialized little granules or lobules. Some of them just fragment, but they have ways of reproducing that involve taking a bit of algae with them so that you don't have just the fungus going out. And some lichens have gone one direction or the other, and some will do a bit of both.
Nice.
Um, and kind of the upshot of all of this, and I think a lichen's superpower for probably what has made it so successful and so unique, is that lichens are incredibly patient. Some of the sugar alcohols that most lichens get from the algae that they partner with, or that the fungi get from those algae, they're sugar alcohols rather than just glucose, which allow them to really tolerate long periods of desiccation. And some lichens have actually been sent out into space and survived in their dry state in the vacuum of space. So when the conditions aren't quite right for them to photosynthesize and metabolize and kind of basically go about their day, they just dry out very quickly and they go completely dormant. This also makes them very easy to collect if that's something that you get into. There are responsible ways to get at that, but unlike mushrooms or plants, there's not a lot of specialized preparation needed to collect a lichen and to have it stay viable as a scientific specimen. You just have to air dry it, and it happens very quickly. And then when the conditions are humid, say there's a bit of fog or morning comes and you have that dew, they just come back to life and start doing their thing. And this also allows lichens to survive a long time, but also grow very slowly and still thrive. And there's some research that suggests that a lot of them are optimized to grow slowly, which is the opposite of what you see in a lot of organisms. And because of this superpower, they're everywhere. That's not to say that every lichen is everywhere, but lichens have been able to colonize every terrestrial environment on the Earth. They're in Antarctica, they're on the seashores on the Bay of Fundy, they're on bare rock, on vertical cliffs like this, on trees, up on hilltops. You can see them in nice old forests, and sometimes you get a real abundance of some specialized things in that kind of high quality habitat. And occasionally you can even find them growing on man-made structures. I know I have some on the vinyl siding on my house that's been growing merrily for the last decade or so. And this playground in urban St. John has a nice smattering of this little yellow lichen growing on the rubberized covering of the playground right underneath the slide. Probably it's nice and moist under there. It's a bit of a shadow from the sun. Lichens are fun to look at as well because they come in all kinds of colors and textures, which also helps to differentiate one species from another. And that kind of variety is really fun to look at, but it's also functional. So the color that a lichen will appear is affected by what kind of photobiont it has, whether it's a blue-green algae, which tends to be quite dark in appearance, or a green algae, whether the lichen is dry or wet in the moment, because they change quite a bit in appearance, whether they have pigments. A lot of lichens produce really specialized pigments that are protective against UV radiation, which is great for the algae that are inside, who are protected when lichen's just waiting around to do its thing. And some of these little structures, surface hairs and crystalline deposits called pruna, not only change the look of the lichen and can make them appear lighter in color, maybe more gray or whitish if they happen to be present, but they actually have a role in regulating temperature. So this is something you tend to see a lot of, apparently, in, say, lichen or in desert habitats and those kinds of lichens that are in really exposed places. And the result is just kind of a riot of colors when you really stop and look around you and look at the trees. And especially if you get out on a foggy or a little bit of a rainy day, the lichens can really pop. And when you look at them, you get lots of different colors. And the fruiting bodies, just like mushrooms, can also be extremely colorful. We get these bright reds or pinks, which is just a lot of fun. If you're going to identify lichens, they tend to be broken into broad morphological groups, because if there's one thing that humans like to do, we like to take things and we like to put them into boxes. And these groups don't always hold up just perfectly, because nothing in nature is ever quite so perfect as to fit neatly in all the boxes. But in really broad strokes, you can describe most lichens as either a foliose form, which is to say it's a kind of leafy, it has a clear top and bottom surface. And some people distinguish smaller foliose lichens, call them squamulose as a separate category. It depends on what book you're following, whether they get into this as a separate thing or not. Fruticose lichens, so-called, are more three-dimensional. So they can be either stringy or spiky or cup-shaped or bushy. There's no clear top and bottom. They have an attachment point, and then they just kind of go from there and either grow up or grow down or out. And then crustose lichens are essentially just painted onto the surface they're growing on. These are some examples of foliose and one little squamulose lichen, if you can see that over here. They can be really pressed down to the surface, or they might be lifting, but what they all have in common is they have a top and a bottom. You could peel them off of their substrate and you can clearly see which is the top and the bottom. In most cases, they're even different colors, and you can see hints of that here and there. Fruticose lichens, a really wide variety of forms. This is just a smattering of them, some growing up from the ground, some dangling down from the trees. And then these are some of the crustose lichens. And you can see in these collections here, the only way to actually take a piece of lichen for a scientific specimen is to remove part of the substrate with it. So that means either going out with a rock chisel or finding some loose pebbles, depending, or cutting bits of bark off of trees or stumps. This isn't something I would recommend just for casual observation, because it's a little bit destructive, but there are responsible ways to collect lichens if this is something that you choose to get into. And if you do want to get into it, let's talk about some of the New Brunswick lichens and what kinds of things you can find and what the challenges are. So what I think a lot of people wouldn't realize is we have over 800 species of lichen in New Brunswick that fit into some of these broad categories. Some of them are field identifiable. Some of them you need a microscope and possibly some detailed chemistry to actually put a name to. Hundreds of the species we've documented here over the last couple of decades are still not officially reported in the scientific literature. They're just, we know that they're here, but we have made so many discoveries over the past many years through the New Brunswick Museum and others coming to visit, that not everything has been written up in a proper format. And it's something that those of us working on lichens in the province would like to catch up on to some degree. And there are still quite a few understudied habitats or understudied taxonomic groups. Even among the larger, more showy lichens, we've had new provincial records as recently as last year, where people went out and found something that's maybe about that big and spotted it on the trees and said, hey, we haven't reported this from the province. Not something that is really cryptic either, like a very identifiable thing that we've just managed to overlook because the province is big and the lichenologists are few. So there's a lot left to learn about distribution of uncommon species. The threatened species get a certain amount of attention. The really common things, you just walk out and you trip over them. And hundreds of species in between, we don't necessarily have a really good sense for where they're occurring and how common or how rare they really are. It depends on the group and how much search effort there's been and how easily they're identified in the field. So all of that to say that if anyone wants to jump into lichens, there is a lot of room for more eyes on the ground and on the trees to get into it. And if you do want to try, the first thing I would recommend is getting a good hand lens, and you're going to want a book, whether you buy it or borrow it from the library, from a friend. You're going to want to probably get into a book, and that will give you any introductory chapter on lichens will give you a good smattering of lichen biology and of the terminology that you would need to follow a key and to figure out what exactly you're looking for. But in the meantime, there's a platform called iNaturalist. It's not ideal for some of the lichens, but if you know how to take pictures that show all of the critical features of a lichen, often including the underside, and to get some good close-ups, there's an algorithm on there that can help point you in the right direction. And then there are people who will actually go around and look and try to put a name on your lichen. They might not always be successful, but especially if you think you have something significant, it's worth trying and it's a lot of fun, not just for lichens, but for other things. And it's a really great place to get started. Pam was good enough to go out and pick up some lichens off of the forest floor. So I know for those of you who are attending in person, you will have an opportunity to kind of look at some of those things in person. And get to see some of the species I'm going to go over now. One of the first things you're likely to encounter if you go out looking for lichens in New Brunswick is going to be one of the shield lichens, Parmelia. They are common, they're widespread. We have a few gray folio species here, so they look a little something like this, and the underside is typically black. You can barely see it here. I've got a couple of arrows pointing. I hope you can all see my cursor, but if not, the picture on the left shows the underside along the edges, and the picture on the right shows the upper side with kind of a mineral gray leafy lichen. You can find them on trees and on rocks. We only have a handful of species that are actually in this genus and that look like this. And you can find them in urban environments because they're very pollution tolerant, but also in the deep, deep woods on lake shores, kind of all over the place. So you're definitely going to find this, and I know that Pam did. So there's an example there if you're at the schoolhouse. If you look at them up close, you'll see something like this. And I want you to notice something about this picture right offhand. First, there's more than one lichen here. That's pretty typical. If you pick up a branch that blew off of a tree in a windstorm from a forest and it has lichen on it, you might pick it up and see kind of a sea of gray. But if you really look closely and you get out your hand lens and kind of really look at the features, you're probably going to find that there is more than one species there. I think one of the sticks that Pam picked up that's on the table there had maybe 6 or 8 different species on one little branch. So if you look at this under a scope, there are 2 different species here. They're in the same family. They have similar kind of color. That's because they actually have the same pigment in the outer layer that gives them that gray color when they're dry. This one is actually a shield lichen, it's Parmelia, and one of the features that distinguishes that genus from any other leafy gray things that you're going to find on the trees and rocks is this sort of reticulate pattern of white markings. They're called pseudocephalae. Different species, different genera have a different pattern, so sometimes you get little white spots, but in Parmelia, you have this almost network, and it tends to be a little bit discontinuous, like the markings almost want to come all the way together and form a continuous net, but they don't quite. The other thing I want you to notice is that if you compare this with that, one little lobe that belongs to the Parmelia is quite flat, and the other lobes that are wrapping up around it are puffy. If you were to cut through those, you'd find that they're hollow, and that's actually a different genus called hypogymnia or tube lichens. They are famously inflated, and hypogymnia literally means naked bottom. So the other thing you can see that's different is where the underside curls up, there are no rhizines. There are no little sticky outy parts that look kind of like roots. Whereas in Parmelia, you do have rhizines. If you're going to take pictures of these for iNaturalist and you want an identification, you're going to want to try and find somewhere where the underside is exposed because the branching pattern in those rhizines is relevant for species identification. And I'd say this is one of the top things that if I'm trying to identify something for someone on iNaturalist, I'll tell them, I'm not sure about this identification because I can't see the underside. I can't see the rhizines. One of the species we have that's very widespread and very pollution tolerant has this kind of powdery breaking open bit here and there. These are called Cerediia. It's one of those vegetative propagules that I talked about. They're essentially little fluffy bits of a few cells of algae with some fungus wrapped around it. And each little granule can go off and immediately start growing a new lichen as long as it lands somewhere appropriate to grow. But in contrast to just producing fungal spores, which would have to find an algae to partner up with. These reddish brown blobs in the middle, the discs, those are actually fungal fruiting structures. So this lichen is kind of doing both. And you see on the left side, we have Parmelia sulcata. That's the main shield lichen. I think literally is called shield lichen that produces Cerediia. On the right-hand side, there's another species of the same genus that's also very common here and also widespread. And the difference is instead of little bits of powder, it has these more cylindrical, almost finger-like buds that serve the exact same purpose. They break off, land somewhere new, and start a new lichen. If you're out and about looking and you want something a little different, there's something called the common green shield lichen, which is in the same family and used to be considered part of the same genus. You can see the name Flavoparmelia sort of implies it's a type of Parmelia, and flavo refers to this yellowish green color. And it's such a vivid color that on especially kind of humid days, foggy days, you can see it on the trunks of the trees from quite a distance. And if you look at it up close, here again, you see an intermix of two different lichens together. The more gray one in the bottom right corner of the main photo here, that's another Parmelia, another shield lichen. And the sort of yellow-green one is Flavoparmelia, common green shield. The underside is a little bit different between the two as well. Sometimes the color doesn't kind of hit you in the face the same way that it does in this photograph, but if you can find one of those and put it right next to it, then there's no mistaking that yellow-green color. Another one of the lichens that I know that Pam was able to pick up for you to look at, for those of you who are there in person, is something called a crumpled rag lichen. And I think it gets that name from just the general texture of the thing. You often find it in branches in the canopy. And so there's a curious thing that'll happen. You'll be walking through the woods, probably in a coniferous forest. You don't see any of this stuff around you. You might see other lichens on the trunks of the trees. And then there in the middle of the path is this great big thing, the size of the palm of your hand, a very fluffy foliose lichen. And it is foliose. It has a clear upper and lower surface, but it does tend to overlap quite a lot, and it's very three-dimensional. So that's where those lines between foliose and fruticose, those boxes we tend to use, does break down a little bit. If you look at them up close, unlike the Parmelias that we looked at before, there are no Cerediia and no Isidia on this one. This particular species doesn't reproduce vegetatively unless perhaps if a piece of it breaks off and gets attached to another tree, it probably would grow, but that's not quite the same thing as having a specialized structure. So this species is relying on sexual reproduction. And you can see these shiny, kind of irregular reddish brown discs. Those are fruiting bodies belonging to the fungal partner of the lichen. And then these little black pimples along the edges are also typical for this species. You only get those, they're called pycnidia. And in lichens, you really only get those structures in species that also produce sexual fruiting bodies. They kind of play a role in producing those fruiting bodies. They have a different kind of spore in them. And I think where the crumpled part of the crumpled rag name sort of really comes in is in this texture of kind of pits and hollows, ridges and hollows that the thing has. And here again is a bit of Parmelia right in the middle of this lichen. Like I said, Parmelia is kind of everywhere, and you're going to find it wrapped up with a lot of things that you're finding on trees or on rocks. We talked at the beginning a little about lung lichens. Supposedly, they're called lung lichens because the texture of them looks a little bit like lung tissue, or some people will say that they're called lung lichens because they were recognized really early on to be sensitive to air pollution. So where you have these lichens, you have good air quality. There is some truth to that. If you start burning coal in a city somewhere, this is going to be one of the first things to disappear. In some parts of the world, it's considered an old growth indicator, only occurring in really mature forests. But in New Brunswick, as you may be aware, if you walk into any sort of half decent, half mature hardwood forest or mixed wood, you're probably going to see this. If it's a reasonably intact forest, you're going to see at least a little bit of this lichen probably occurring. And it's sort of the bare minimum where you start to look around and go, oh, here's where the good lichening is, and where you're going to start to see some of the more sensitive species. And in New Brunswick, you get it on eastern white cedar as well. This is one that changes really radically between wet and dry. So on the left-hand side of the page here, we have just trunks completely covered in dry lobaria, and they look just kind of like a shade of gray, more or less. Kind of a greenish gray, but it's a really dull color. If you put some water on those, either throw your water bottle at it or just let it rain, you can really see the green algae showing through. And this is one of the lichens that actually has green algae and cyanobacteria both. And though you don't see the cyanobacteria, that's part of what makes it sensitive to air pollution, probably. On the whole, cyanobacteria or cyanolichens, the ones that partner up with cyanobacteria, are more sensitive to air pollution. And they're more sensitive in general to disturbances in humidity in the forest. And where a lot of the lichens we're looking at have either vegetative propagules or they have sexual reproduction, lobaria does it all. It's more common to see it without these kind of reddish-brown fruiting bodies, but they do produce them sometimes. Not all that infrequently, especially if they're in good habitat. And you can see you get all of the things happening at once. They have Cerida and Isidia and these apothecia that produce sexual fungal spores. We have several species that fall under old man's beard in New Brunswick. And again, I know that Pam collected some of those, so they have a few lookalikes to them. But in general, they're pretty easy to identify that you have a species of Usnea or one of the old man's beards. It's much more difficult to actually identify which species you have. So these can be pretty bushy or really long and pendant. The longest one that we have in New Brunswick, appropriately enough called Usnea longissima, which literally means the longest one. Sometimes also called Methuselah's beard. It can grow up to meters long. It does that more often on the West Coast, I think, where it's very humid in these old forests. And in New Brunswick, it's really associated with humid forests. Either they're forests that have a coastal influence or old growth forests that are humid because of that kind of long continuity of trees holding the moisture and all that moss and soil building up and holding a lot of humidity in the air. You don't get these in really disturbed forests. So it's one that would maybe make a good provincial emblem, and something that's been discussed as possibilities. We'll see if that might happen in the future. One thing that all of the old man's beards have in common that sets them apart from all the other lichens is that they have sort of a springy, elastic central cord. It's not necessarily that elastic, but it is tougher than everything else. So I know that Pam collected some of these, and for those of you who are actually there in person, when you have your coffee break, you might, if it's okay with her, you might want to mess with those lichens a little bit. Just give them a gentle kind of a tug and you should be able to expose little bits of this kind of middle cord that grows up through the middle of them. There are some other things that grow in a similar way to old man's beards, but they have various differences, including that they lack that central cord. So we have, on the one hand here, we have a species of Ramalina, a sinewed bushy lichen, so-called, or the boreal oak moss on the other side. You can find these across the province, and a lot of people will mistake them for old man's beards because you do get some bushy old man's beards. When you look at them really closely, and especially if you're in doubt, give them that little tug, you'll find that they have no central cord. They have fluffy stuff inside. There aren't multiple layers. But they have the same chemical on the outside that is a strong UV protective pigment. If you put it under a UV light, the whole thing goes dark. It really protects against UV, and several species that have that kind of yellowy green color share that same pigment. I'm going to go over these last few of the common things pretty quickly. I think you get the general idea. When you're looking at a lichen, if you want to know what it is, you need to get to know a little bit about the group that you're looking at and figure out which features are really important. And if you're just starting out, I would say if you want to photograph some things and try to get a name for them, you want to just photograph every single feature that you can see yourself. Use your eyes and think, what does this thing have? Does it have brown blobs? Does it have funny little needle-like projections or something? Just look it all over top to bottom and try and capture all of that. And someone who knows what they're looking at and the algorithm that runs iNaturalist should be able to pick some of that out for you. On this page, we have some of the pixie cups, reindeer lichens, things belonging to the genus Cladonia. This is a huge genus, and it can be difficult to pin down individual species, but they all kind of have this three-dimensional thing going, and they come in a variety of colors and shapes, but you find them growing up from the ground or from the bases of trees or sometimes over mossy logs and that kind of thing. And they're a lot of fun to look at. Some of them have fun fungi on them too. You may also see some of this maritime sunburst lichen out and about. It especially likes kind of coastal areas. I did look on iNaturalist and I saw there are some observations from near Miramichi. So I would say have a pretty good chance of spotting it. And with this bright orange color it tends to have, it's very identifiable. It's one that you don't need a lot of specialized skill to pin down. If you get a good photograph of it, just from the shape of it and the color, it's possible to pin down what it is without microscopy and without detailed chemical tests. Some of the crests I find people tend to post include bitterwort, which is a white and gray lichen that produces Cerediae. It's called bitterwort because it is very bitter. Even the Latin name refers to it being bitter. Amara means bitter. That's not some kind of a challenge for those of you who have a certain amount of bravado. You just seriously shouldn't taste it. I was out in the field with someone who did because I think he thought it would be like hops or something, and he likes things that are bitter. It took an hour for him to get the taste out of his mouth, and I don't know how many blueberries he ate trying to chase the thing down. Just don't eat it. It just tastes really bad. If you want to pin down exactly what it is, there's a chemical test that you can do instead. It turns purple under certain conditions. Graphoscripta is a really fun one. Some people say that you've had fairies there writing on the trees if you find it. And sometimes you can find birch trees that are just covered in large swaths of this. And it's called Graphoscripta because it looks a little bit like pictures of writing. It's also why it's called in English a script lichen. It's aptly named. It does kind of look like someone has been writing on the trees. Those long black things are fruiting bodies. They're just a different shape from the round ones that we saw on the other lichens. And this is a favorite, this pink earth lichen. It grows on mineral soil, and it has these small stalked mushroom-like fruiting bodies. And if you get a lot of it along the roadsides where there are exposed mineral soil, sometimes in the rain, the whole thing gets kind of a pinkish hue. And it's just a really pretty one, and it's very identifiable. So if you see it out there, I recommend taking a peek. Now, when I say that lichens are everywhere, I don't mean that every lichen is everywhere. Not every lichen is everywhere. Every species has its own general requirements, some very broad, like the shield lichens I mentioned, and some very, very specific. Some of them have such exacting requirements that it's hard to figure out exactly what habitat it will tolerate, and those tend to be rare on the ground. Some species are very sensitive to pollution. If you think about the way that they absorb moisture from the air, it makes sense that they would absorb any air pollution that's out there as well. And that depending on how sensitive they are to that, that could be pretty bad for you. If you think about all the filtration systems that we have in our bodies, lichens don't have that on the same level. And a lot of species are also very sensitive to just general anthropogenic disturbance. If you think about species that require a lot of very steady humidity, kind of the more sensitive ones that really like the deep forest, they're not going to react well if there's a clear cut nearby. Even if their tree is left standing, it just changes the entire flow of humidity through that area and it destabilizes what it needs to survive. And so there's a thing with lichens, and some studies have kind of borne this up, where as the forests continue as forests for a long time, you get more diversity. And some species don't appear at all until a forest has been really well established and it's already essentially old growth when you get all the little niches. Some of that may be because it takes time to establish because of the difficulties of finding the right photosynthetic partner and all of that. And some of it's probably finding the right niche, the right microclimate, and the right microhabitat that's just so for a species to be able to thrive. If you find species that are known to be threatened and you're just out looking for casual observation, you should always keep in mind that lichens in general are slow growing. And that means you can't pick them like a flower and have them grow back the next week. They take time and you shouldn't disturb them more than necessary, especially if you know that they're threatened. The best thing to do if you want to add data and you're starting out, if it's not part of a real scientific project where you maybe have permits, someone from, say, DNR knows that you're out and collecting rare species or looking for rare species, and that sometimes you might need a specimen to properly document that. The best thing to do for the casual observer would be to take photos, note as precise a location as you can with a GPS if possible, or the location on your phone, whatever's to hand. And then if you think it's really important, alert an expert. You can post things on iNaturalist, you could write to the museum, or you could get in touch with someone from the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center. They're always on the lookout for this kind of thing. But that does mean you need to do some homework to know what you're looking for. Out of 800 species that we have, which ones do we know are threatened, that we already know are at risk or in trouble on the landscape? The first place I would always suggest checking would be the Canadian Species at Risk Public Registry. They have this great, if you can find it, there's a filter where you can search up species and you can either look up an individual species that you already know that you're interested in, or you can search by province and by group and just narrow it down. There are only about 10 species that have been assessed that are known to occur in New Brunswick and that have been looked at by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. That doesn't mean those are the only species that are threatened, but knowing those species that are already of concern and that we know have pretty exacting requirements for where they're going to grow is a great place to start if you want to be adding to that kind of conservation data set. I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail about what they all look like and where they all grow, but I'm going to do a quick flyby of the ones that we know are still extant in the province. So we have a couple that are listed as endangered that may very well just not actually be here anymore, where no one has seen them, say, in either 40 or 100 years in some cases. There isn't any evidence that they are necessarily still in New Brunswick. But for the ones that we know are still here, but that they're documented to be struggling, I'll go over quickly some photographs of those. And then if for anyone who really wants to dive into it, I just suggest doing your homework. There is a wonderful wealth of information in all the CSIWIC status reports that are published. So if you go to that Canadian Species at Risk Public Registry, you can find those status reports and they'll give you information on what the species looks like, where it's been found before, what kind of habitat it requires as far as we are aware. And it's a great jumping off place. And it's just so much information packed into those reports that it's wonderful. We do also have a provincial committee on the status of species at risk. There's a screenshot I've included here, and it will give you province level assessments and status for the species that they've gotten through. And they haven't covered quite everything yet that has been assessed by CSIWIC. But of the ones that they have, I know one species, the wrinkled shingle lichen, is marked as more endangered in New Brunswick than it is in Canada as a whole. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a large proportion of the records that we have are on black ash, which is itself threatened by emerald ash borer. So all of this, when you think about it, kind of comes together to paint a broader picture. So quite quickly, these are some species, two of the species that are listed as threatened that occur in New Brunswick and that are restricted to older growth forests on hardwood. I don't think that it's likely you would find these in the Miramichi area, especially Heterodermia squamulosa, the scaly fringe lichen, which is in New Brunswick only known from the Fundy Coast within about 25 kilometers of the Fundy Coast. But never say never. And you know, we only have so many eyes on the trees, on the ground. It's great to have people out looking, and you never know what you might find that maybe isn't listed, but might be equally interesting. So it's certainly worth looking. The black foam lichen is really interesting as the only lichen that we have that has kind of a weird spongy bottom. I should have included a close-up here, but if you look at the CSIWIC report or you just look it up online, you can, I'm sure, find pictures of it. And it's just this weird black sponge of a bottom. Nothing else that we have looks anything like that. In human undisturbed coastal forests, either swamp forests with eastern white cedar or mature hardwood forests, exclusively so far on the Fundy Coast, there's this beautiful blue felt lichen. It's much more common in Newfoundland and in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia actually adopted it as their provincial emblem. They have a lichen that's been adopted by the provincial government as an emblem for the province, kind of like how we have a purple violet and the black-capped chickadee for New Brunswick. And this is the one that they chose. It's beautiful. It's worth learning it's worth even just looking at some pictures of it because it's such a pretty thing up close. And then if you find yourself in undisturbed swamp forests, particularly with a lot of eastern white cedar through occidentalis, we have a couple of things. And I know that the Nature Trust of New Brunswick and also some people working for the Bethknamakati Nation have been looking out for these species among a few others and have had some great success at finding more records and filling in some gaps in that picture. In terms of knowing where we stand for conservation of these things. So if you're going to get out there and really jump into lichens, definitely look at a book, learn these species, and just go responsibly and tread lightly where you go. But there is so much to discover. It's great fun. I hope someone does kind of jump in. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time, but I did want to talk a little bit about my little pet fungi. So we've talked about, this is the final part of my talk I wanted to get into. And this is an active area of research for us. And so New Brunswick Museum is leading some research in this area. And it's really an underappreciated group of fungi in terms of what's been reported across even North America. It's that they tend to be overlooked. So we've looked a little bit at what's involved in learning to see lichens and see some of the differences in kind of a sea of grayish green stuff on the trees. When you look a little bit more closely at the lichens, sometimes you find little fungi growing there. And if you're like me, you might think that this is a really fun way to kind of double your workload by looking for little fungi that are growing on the lichens, which already take quite a lot of work to identify because we have hundreds of species to choose from, and some of them require microscopy. What a Lichenicolous fungus is just in essence a fungus that has evolved to either obligately or habitually fruit and grow on a lichen. Some of them are very, very specific and will grow on exactly one species of lichen. Those ones are my favorites, but this is what happens when you start looking a little too closely at the lichens in the forest and in your yard. So you have a specimen like this. This is one of the cladonias, one of the reindeer lichens. And that's fine. There are dozens of species, and it takes a bit of work just to pin down exactly which species are you looking at. And then one day you look at your specimen and you look a little closer and you see maybe up just at the top edge here, there's something a little different on the stalk of the lichen. If you put that under the scope, what you find is, oh, look at that. Couple of little fruiting bodies of an unrelated fungus. This is not a typical part of what this lichen looks like. And then if you do some microscopy, you might find that it is the only Atlantic Canadian record of Cryptodiscus cladonicula. Isn't that fun? But kind of dismaying because it's a lot of extra work. And then if you take something like, say, the barnacle lichen, or tree barnacles, I think they're called, it's a really striking thing. It looks like it could just as easily be a sea creature. And if you look at this little scale bar that I put up in the corner, that's only 1 millimeter. So you're not talking about something huge. This is one of the crustose species that you'd need to collect the bark to actually study the lichen. And in order to identify exactly which species this is, you do need to do some microscopy and check the spores to make sure that you have the correct species. It turns out that we have at least 2 fungi that grow on this one lichen. Both of them are really specific to that one host. In all the world, they've never been reported from any other type of lichen, and people have looked. One of them, Scatea nichkii, and I'm sorry, they don't have common names, but you can always make some up. It's pretty widespread. It's been reported from Europe, sometimes associated with ancient woodlands or forests of long continuity. It's also been reported from Nova Scotia, and I think some other places, like maybe the Canary Islands, possibly Colombia. Scatea thelytromatis has been reported much less frequently. None of these things are reported every other day, but for Scatea thelytromatis, I believe it's been reported from Scotland, Colombia, and the Canary Islands. It has never been reported formally from North America, but we do now know that it's here. We've seen it in Newfoundland, and as of last year, we found it in New Brunswick. It's restricted to coastal areas on this lichen that is itself restricted to coastal areas in New Brunswick. This is what they look like. They're just these tiny little bumps. Scatea nichkii causes some brown staining on the host, and it has kind of a brownish color macroscopically. Scatea thelytromatis is more black, and it doesn't have that staining. And then under the scope, they have different colors. When you add potassium hydroxide, Scatea nichkii almost turns Christmas colors. You get some magenta in the bottom and a bright green, and honestly, the photo doesn't do it any justice. It's a lot of fun to watch this happen under the slide. We didn't have any records of these in New Brunswick until we started really looking at our lichens, and just couldn't resist kind of looking to see, well, what was that weird little bump on the lichen, which is itself just a little bump on the tree. And it turns out these things are pretty ubiquitous, and they have different kinds of impacts on their host. Some of them, they don't really cause any symptoms, and you really need to know the lichens in order to be able to spot them. Some, like the ones in this panel, they make the lichen really sick, or they grow on lichens that are already sick. Sometimes it's not very clear, but what you'll tend to see is either some necrosis, some discoloration. Sometimes you see a patch like you see on the right-hand side here, where something has happened to the lichen. You can see that some of it's dead. Those, even if you can't see the causative agent very clearly because they're very, very small, they're microscopic, you can at least see that there's something up, and you can collect that and take it back to the lab for study, which is what I do. Some other species are evolved to kind of induce a gall formation in the lichen that they infect, which sort of, to me at least, implies a long evolutionary history. Whether that holds up, certainly there's some kind of interplay happening between these fungi that is really particular, kind of like when you get insects causing a gall in a lot of plants where they're doing something very specialized and making a thing happen in the plant tissue. There's something similar at play with these. And these tend to be pretty visible because the lichen's suddenly swelling and doing a weird thing. But even then, you kind of need to know that that's not normal for the lichen that you're looking at in order to know that there's a fungus you should be investigating. These are a couple of the ones that we looked at before. Up in the left-hand corner here is a species that Stephen Clayton and I described with a researcher from New York who's now deceased. This species is only known from northern New Brunswick, southern coastal New Brunswick, and I believe Quebec. And the lichen that it's on, we didn't know actually occurred this far north. We thought that in North America it was restricted to the southern Appalachians in the Smoky Mountains. So the whole thing was a surprise, and we wrote a paper just about this, and it turned out the fungus growing on it is one of these very host-specific things, and also no one had ever seen it before. And half of the specimens that we looked at of this lichen were infected with this fungus, but none of them from outside of our immediate region here in the Northeast. So as of right now, it's considered a Canadian endemic. Whether that holds up remains to be seen. In some cases, you get kind of like a blackening of the lichen that you're looking at, and then that can be a real clue. So here we have a couple of little guys. The one on the right, Opographa parmelia purida, is one that occurs on that shield lichen that we talked about at the beginning. This thing didn't have a name. We've only found it in a few places in New Brunswick. No one has collected it outside of New Brunswick, at least as far as I know. And it wasn't described until 2021 when we finally put a name on it. This time we partnered up with someone working in Belgium, a real leader in the field, both in Opographa, which is sometimes a lichen and sometimes a parasitic fungus, and in Lichenicolous fungi in general. It was a really fun collaboration, and now we have a name for the thing, and I'm hoping someone outside of New Brunswick will eventually pick this thing up and we'll get a better sense of where it is, because its host occurs all across the Northern Hemisphere, and it shouldn't just be in New Brunswick. That doesn't make sense. So when you start looking at all these symptoms and all the things that kind of crop up, you realize you're looking at easily twice the amount of identification work, especially in cases where sometimes you have two fungi growing on one lichen. This is a problem. So what do you do? What a lot of people do who are studying lichens, because it's lichenologists who tend to find these fungi, is they just kind of put a pin in it, they run away, they pretend it doesn't exist. That's how you get a situation where you don't have a lot of records of these things because they're too difficult. The literature is really scattered, and who's got the time? Or you could be like me. You could cut into some of them, realize that the microscopy is really fun, and that there's such a broad variety of form to these things that you kind of fall in love and you decide maybe you'll be the person to want to deal with them. And then you contact a bunch of your friends and gather up as many records as you can. So that's what we've done with the New Brunswick Museum. Myself and my mentor, Stephen Clayton, we got in touch with anyone who's collected any of these things in Atlantic Canada, and we did a thorough literature review, and we started really pulling together as much information as we can, which is a real can of worms because it turns out we have a lot of species. This is not quite up to date, but as of 2022, this map shows the general search effort. And in this graph on the side, you get kind of the sense that we've looked at a lot more specimens from New Brunswick, which makes sense because that's where I'm doing most of my field work, where Stephen's doing most of his. We have some good partners in Newfoundland, so we've got lots of good Newfoundland records as well, and we've spent some time over there and some time in Nova Scotia, but the distribution of effort is really uneven between the provinces, and I think that's okay as long as we recognize that. And this is what we found, more or less. I hope you can all see that graph. It's cutting off a little bit for me from people's faces on the side. Right about 2007, I think I said it was fall of 2007 that I identified my first Lichenicolous fungus and kind of started down this road. You can see from that point on, there was a real spike. And then this green line here for New Brunswick, which was trailing behind Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, has kind of crept right up. And the chart on the side here shows how many of those records are published. These numbers are not up to date. A lot of these records have since been published, and we've also found several more things for the region and several more things for New Brunswick. And we are also working on describing more species that it turns out are new to science, in collaboration with various people from all over the world, which is wonderful. And I can't teach you to identify all 200 and some species that we get, so I thought I'd bring this back once again to the shield lichens. Here's some of the variety of species that you get just on Parmelia sulcata in Atlantic Canada. And it gives you the idea of kind of the different kinds of symptoms that you get, the different form and possibly function that you have with these different fungi, and how it really affects the lichen differently. And this is just on one host. So it's a very common host, and we have several species in the province and in Atlantic Canada that occur on this one host, but still, I think it's a pretty cool diversity of form. So Lichenopuccinia piltii, this is a weird thing. I think the first few times I looked at it, I overlooked the critical features, because the critical features are these asexual spores that are producing around the outside of these black blobs. I'm sure I probably found this in the past, and I probably was looking for something inside of the black blobs, and then when I didn't find anything, I didn't look any further. But we have finally realized that we have this thing in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and it's probably throughout the region, and it just, all of its spores are along the outside. Who knew? Once you know that, it's pretty identifiable under the microscope. We have Arthrophocopsis parmeliarum. This thing is seemingly not very common in our region. We only have a handful of records. And then Naselechia oxyspora. These look somewhat similar, but not really. And then under the microscope, they're quite different from each other. And Naselechia is both more of a generalist on more different hosts, and also is more common. There's another thing about Naselechia oxyspora. It can induce these strange gall formations. It's one of those fungi that interacts in that way with the lichen. And it's also extremely closely related to the lichens that it infects. It's actually in the same family. So presumably its ancestor may have been a lichen, and then it just learned to live a reduced parasitic kind of existence instead, which is really interesting. Some people actually treat it under the same genus, have named it under the same genus as one of the lichens we have in our region that it tends to infect. That's not a name that we've adopted, but it's one way to do the taxonomy if you wanted to. That fungus, the Naselechia oxyspora, that's closely related to the lichen that it infects, it sometimes gets infected in turn with something else called Abrothalus parmeliarum. And then that thing can also become infected with another unrelated fungus, which we haven't found here yet, but it may only be a matter of time. It was just recently described. So there are kind of layers and layers and layers of parasitism here. And it's kind of like that old song, the Rattling Bog, the bog down in the valley, with the bird in the nest and the nest on the tree, and etc. And these are really pretty in section. They kind of turn green when you add potassium hydroxide to them. So as soon as I saw that and I saw these cute little warty spores with the uneven cells in them, I was hooked. And now these things are taxonomically kind of difficult. There's some work that needs to happen to figure out where the lines between species are, not just in New Brunswick, but globally. But nonetheless, I love seeing them and I love looking at them under the microscope, and they're just they're very recognizable and very fun. I want to know what they're all about. One of the more common species that we have here is another sort of black blob, but unlike the Lichenicolous that we looked at several slides ago, this one, when you cut through the middle of it, it's got these little clearish patches. And what it actually is little flask-shaped fruiting bodies all clustered together in what's called a stroma. And a stroma is kind of like daisy of the fungus world, where a daisy is a compound flower that's actually multiple flowers all pressed together. A stromatic fungus is a bunch of little fungal fruiting bodies all pressed together into one larger structure, like a compound flower. And if you cut through these, you can find these quite large for a small fungus, brown spores, typically 3 septate, and very, very visible. This is a very identifiable thing once you learn what you're looking for and if you have good access to a microscope. And even without that, if you just cut one edge away, you can see the little fertile locules in the middle, and that's enough of a clue to kind of make a very educated guess that that's what fungus you're looking at. Paragraph superveniens is not a species that we knew we had in New Brunswick until a few years ago. And it's been found in the Kennedy Lakes Protected Natural Area. That is the only place it's been found. This thing is incredibly rare. Nobody seems to quite know why. It's very widespread across the Northern Hemisphere, but reports of it globally are really scattered, even though it's a very distinctive thing and the host is quite common. It's, again, on that shield lichen. You might have a chance of finding this in the Miramichi area. This is what it looks like up close. It kind of has multiple black fruiting bodies kind of squished together with a white outline around it, and it grows on that very common group of lichens. I think it may only be known from Parmelia sulcata, which is the shield lichen that has little powdery bits, and you can kind of see that here. Nobody really knows why it's so rarely reported. I would love to see a better specimen of this from New Brunswick. The only specimen that has been found so far came out of the a tree or a branch that fell from the canopy. So that might be part of the piece that we're missing. Maybe it's something that likes to grow way up in the trees, or maybe it's only there part of the year. I don't know what the story is, but apart from this one specimen that Stephen Clayton found there in 2022 in the Kennedy Lakes Protected Natural Area, on that same hillside where I took the goofy selfie, where I was so happy to find that other fungus, the only other reports that we have for North America are at least 50 years old, and they're from Newfoundland and Quebec, from the 1940s and I think 1950s. We don't have any recent reports of this thing. So no one's even been able to sequence it and see where it really belongs. Oh, excuse me. I seem to have closed my slide. I'm going to put that back on. That was almost my last slides, and we're almost through all of this. If you just bear with me.
That's good.
Can you guys see the slide view of this?
Yeah.
Okay. Did the slide just change?
No.
No. Okay, hold on. Sorry. So close without hitting a button. I just got excited about that one. Okay, here we go. This one I talked about a few slides ago. We actually described this from New Brunswick, and so far all the reports of it are from New Brunswick. We originally only found it in minerotrophic, old growth cedar swamp forests, but now we have a couple of other reports from other old growth forests that that seem to have been forests for a long time. So that kind of forest of long continuity. It does seem to be a species that probably has pretty exacting requirements, even though its host does not. But I'd also be very happy for someone to find it in a run-of-the-mill backyard and prove me wrong on that. More eyes out searching would be great. It does seem to kill the host that it's on. And this is what it looks like up close. And I'm going to leave it there. These are the contributors so far to this work. And I'm going to leave it on this page. There's some extra resources. If anyone wants book recommendations, or if you want the links to the Species at Risk Public Registry or any of the information that I've gone through tonight, you can always get in touch and ask me for that. But that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions about all of that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's Peter. I'm just trying to fix up my view here. What is the role of lichens in its niche in terms of how it relates to other organisms and how it fits into the bigger picture?
Well, that's a great question. In general, I believe in all biodiversity has its own inherent value, but there are lots of specific ways in which lichens interact with other things that we do know about. So let me see. Some birds use them in their nests. The northern Parula warbler in particular is known to use old man's beard in its nest. Caribou eat it. I've seen deer eating lichens off of the trees as well. Lots of invertebrates either live in the lichens or they eat lichens, or probably some of both. Some lichens have been shown to destroy prions in the environment. I don't know what exactly that does for us, if that has a clear benefit, but it's interesting at least. And some of the lichens fix nitrogen that's presumably used by other organisms as well, particularly the cyanolichen lichens, the ones that have cyanobacteria as a photosynthetic partner. They can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And I'm sure that there are other things, but off the top of my head and based on what we do know, those are some of the things that they do.
Thank you.
Oh, they also break up rock.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
We probably got some of our soil from early lichens breaking up little grains of rock.
You did say at the beginning that the lichen at least are not harmful to their host or to their support structure.
Well,
with exceptions.
I maybe oversimplified that. They don't eat the trees.
Right.
But if they're growing on your granite monuments or something, they will destroy rock over time because rock doesn't replenish itself.
Right. Matt, you had a question?
Pink earth lichen, you said it grew on mineral soils. And what do you mean by that? Like rocks? Or?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. If someone could repeat it.
Pink earth lichens, you said it grows on mineral soils?
Yes.
What do you mean by that, by mineral soils, like rocks?
So kind of the deep soil, not the humus that you get exposed in the forests, but like anywhere where you've dug deeper and you get kind of below that organic level to just bare soil. That's what I mean by mineral soil.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to me how it seems to outcompete plants in certain places.
I'm sorry, again, I only caught about half of that.
Kind of interesting to me how it seems to outcompete plants in certain places. I've seen it grow in swaths in the forest, really just kind of large areas, which is surprising for lichen.
Yeah. I think especially where there's not a lot of soil, and you'll get kind of a mix of bryophytes and lichens that will colonize those habitats. And it's really probably an underappreciated source of colonization of kind of bare inhospitable places.
Thanks.
I've kind of seen it mostly along roads, like where someone's made a road in the woods. So they've
Yep.
And then on the side of the road, that's where you see the pink earth lichen.
Yeah. There's a really similar species that you'll find on rotting wood. And sometimes people will confuse them for each other. They are related. I think it's called candy lichen, but it's got the similar kind of pink fruiting bodies against a minty green background. You find it on well-rotted stumps or occasionally on bare rock, which is confusing, but yeah.
Yes,
Do any have medicinal qualities, like for nutrients for humans? And I'm thinking of native practices. Did they ever make tea with lichen? Or have any uses like for food or for medicine?
could you hear that, Kendra?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. Can you repeat it?
The First Nation use of lichens?
That's
Essentially.
First Nations use or for anybody for medicine.
Okay, for human uses of lichens, particularly perhaps the First Nations people.
Well, I don't think I can really speak to First Nations use of lichens because I'm not sure what traditional uses there might be. I know that there are at least some traditional names for some of the lichens. As far as just generally human uses, dyes, certainly. Harris tweed, I think, is quite famously made from lichen-based dyes. Sometimes you see them put forward as like a survival food. I've heard of people using old man's beard as a tincture of some kind as a medicine. I'm not recommending that. I don't know anything about the efficacy of that. When I think of old man's beards, I think they have all kinds of interesting chemistry. They're not necessarily acids that I would necessarily want to ingest, but they may have some bioactive properties that other people are tapping into that I don't happen to know about. People use lichens in art. People use some of the caribou lichens in like little dioramas to represent little trees. I'm sure I'm overlooking some uses. Some of the rock tripes people eat as survival food, if needed.
Anna in Fredericton has a question.
Oh,
Yep.
you mentioned prion diseases. I was wondering if there's much evidence showing that lichens might limit the spread of things like chronic wasting disease in elk.
And that I haven't heard any applied use of that. I'm just aware of the one, and they might exist. I may not be up on that area of literature. I was just aware of one study that was done probably about 15 years ago, or maybe around 2008, where they showed that specifically some of the caribou lichens, so it may have a role in that particular disease, can destroy prions in the environment. So I would think it could be relevant, just in limiting that environmental exposure. But I also don't know a lot about how that disease spreads, but it certainly raises interesting questions. It seems possible.
It's spread in body fluids from the animals. So the fact that it might not live as long in the environment because of lichens does sound like it might help it, spread less. So that's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Kendra, could you speak a little bit on the age of some of those lichens on rocks?
Put me on the spot, Mark. Some of them are really old. Some of the age studies that people have done looking at Arctic lichens are, I want to say some of them just based on the growth rates, they suspect that they're hundreds or maybe 1,000 years old. But they certainly they can grow so slowly that just extrapolating backward from that, they seem to be they can be pretty ancient. But the problem is it takes a long time to do those studies to watch the lichens grow. And none of us has yet managed to live 1,000 years to watch a single phallus and see how it grows. And some of those aging studies wouldn't necessarily take into account that parts of the lichen may die off and then be recolonized by something else, and some of those dynamics. So it's really hard to know exactly, but I know that there have been studies published about that particularly. Not by me.
I don't know whether I'm muted here or not.
No, no, that's great, Ian.
Okay. One thing you mentioned, the Kennedy Fowler and Fowler Lakes. I remember going in there paddling years ago.
Mhm.
And one of the things that was very distinctive in there is there's a distinct line below which there are fewer lichens. And there's also the remains of an old dam, that was used in logging days at the outlet. And so
Okay.
that line reflects the change in water level in Kennedy Lake
Huh.
from when that dam was last used. So, anyway, that's one thought. I think I've also heard that one of the reasons there's no longer caribou in New Brunswick is because there aren't the mature forests that would support the lichen growth that would have been essential for them. Although lots of other reasons too.
Oh, that's interesting. As far as sorry, there's a train outside my window. I don't know if if anyone else can hear that. It's very loud. What I've heard about the caribou is that as we modified the landscape and the white-tailed deer came in, they brought with them basically brain worms that the caribou can't tolerate. But, most things are more complicated than that. Could I ask you, Ian, are you the Ian Walker whose lichens we have in the collection here from Mount Allison?
Yeah. Yeah, there'd be some there. And I just tagged you in a thing in iNaturalist. There was a Lichenicolous fungus, I presume, from the Broken Islands that I'm puzzled by.
Okay, I'll take a look.
There was something else I was going to say. You broke my thought there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, one thing I could tell you a story is I remember, do you ever meet Wolfgang Moss?
I did. Yes,
Yeah.
we have his collections.
Interesting character. I met him when he was first looking for Erioderma pedicellata.
Mhm.
And at that time, it had been reported from Grand Manan. That was the type location for it.
Yeah.
And I think he had gone looking and couldn't find it anywhere on Grand Manan.
Yeah.
And at that point, it wasn't known to exist anywhere in the world because it had been reported from Sweden. But, that site seemed to be lost. Anyway, he came talking to me because he understood that I knew where to find lobaria on spruce around Sackville.
Okay.
Anyway, so I took him and showed him a couple of locations, and he said, no, that wouldn't be the right habitat. But at that point, it was not known anywhere else in the world. But a couple of years later, by that point, he had explored parts of Nova Scotia, the hypermaritime belt of Nova Scotia,
Mhm.
and he had nailed down that you would go to the north side of a bog, look on the north side of a fir tree that was covered in this reddish liverwort, Frulania asagrana.
Yeah.
Look for Lobaria scorbiculata, and if you found all that combination of things, you're likely to find Erioderma decellata. And he had mapped so many locations through Nova Scotia and Newfoundland by that point. I said to him, no one's going to believe you this is endangered any. But he had developed such a search image for the thing that it was just quite incredible.
It is. His notes are really very detailed. And the search effort for the specific lichens that he homed in on, including Erioderma, it's really evident in his collecting. It's remarkable. And he wrote a poem about that I think it was about that lichen, either that or the other Areoderma mollissimum, which when we went to get the collections from his home when he was still living there and before he died, he read us this poem. I don't know if it survived into the archives or if his children have it, but he really cared a lot about that lichen.
Oh, I know one other thought. Are there any lichens in New Brunswick that might be considered invasive?
There is, I don't know about invasive, but in the St. John region, there's at least one that's thought to have evolved around sulfur springs. That it clearly isn't native to here. It's not indigenous to North America. It was introduced here. I'm not sure. I think maybe New York, but it's in St. John. It's in at least one US city. It's in Halifax. It's one of the crustose species. It's called Lichenicolous Fungi.
Oh yeah, I know it from Halifax.
Yeah, I think people call it like the sulfur eater. It's that it not only is really tolerant of sulfur pollution, but it seems to actually require it as part of its biology. So it would be really interesting to go back to sites that Stephen Clayton led a whole study on this, which we didn't publish, but that's how I got my start at the museum, was looking at lichens and air quality in the St. John region when I was a student under Stephen Clayton. And it would be really interesting to go back and visit the sites that we hit almost 20 years ago and see whether the footprint of Lichenicolous Fungi is still as extensive as it was, or if it's shrunk, because some of the point sources of sulfur pollution in the immediate area here are less than what they were. Colson Cove coal plant in particular had new sulfur scrubbers installed. Oh, geez, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. That's really cut down on, there used to be a visible plume across the harbor when the wind was just so, and you don't see it anymore since they put that in.
I'm currently living in Kelowna, British Columbia, and Xanthoria parietina, I've heard it referred to as being invasive.
In Ontario, at least, it seems to be. It wasn't there before, and people are tracking its progress. I don't know about in BC.
Yeah, and here, it only seems to be on non-native shade trees.
Interesting.
So, to regard it as being invasive when it doesn't impact on any of the native trees, it seems a bit of a stretch, but nevertheless, it's something that I just find on, hardwoods. And someone said, they all seem to be hardwoods that came from nurseries, maybe from nurseries on the coast, and have been planted around town.
That's really interesting. It's interesting that it's surviving, but you're right. Invasive implies something more than just new to the area.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem to be displacing anything from its native habitat here.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anyway, say hi to Stephen.
I will. It's really nice to meet you. Put a face to the name.
Okay, Jim?
Didn't lichens from Europe have come over as ballast on the ballast rocks and then escaped here? I know most of it was probably put into water, but maybe people scavenged from those rock piles for other uses, and lichens may have survived. That's a possibility.
Could you hear that?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt, but I think anyone who's not sitting right next to the microphone in the school, I just really can't hear.
No, I will repeat. Jim is wondering about ballast from chips, stones being deposited. Some may have been put to use, and whether any lichens may have accompanied those stones, and therefore become invasive.
I would say it's a possible scenario. I'm not aware of anything where that's a kind of an established fact. I could think of some things that are in the collection here where maybe 100 years ago, someone noted that some plant or other was growing at a ballast site that didn't actually necessarily persist. But I'm not aware of anyone tracking the same with the lichens. And given where some of the ballast would have been dumped, I don't know. It would depend on whether it could tolerate those salty conditions if it was dumped right on the shore, like say in the harbor, and where our tides are so high. So I guess the short answer is it's possible, but I don't know.
Okay, Jim.
I don't think anyone does.
Would have been a source of material for the local people, and I'm sure they put some of them to use. So that was the method I would see for transferring it from that salty environment or freshwater environment.
Yeah. Well, I believe like Stone Church in St. John was made of ballast rocks, and that would have been many places. Yeah. So we have buildings here made with ballast rocks, but obviously we know little or nothing about what lichens may have been involved. Sorry, Jim?
It's an interesting question whether you could, I mean, some of the lichens theoretically could even have survived, but picturing the buildings around town, I think they were probably scrubbed clean. And certainly when the rock was cut to build, the lichens would have been cut off of it as well. But it is a really interesting question. And in some cases, we can't really know whether something that we're finding in the province that we didn't know was here, whether it was always here and we overlooked it, or if it's come in from somewhere else. It depends on the situation and how well known that species was to begin with. So be the same problem with some of our plants, trying to figure out whether something has become naturalized here over hundreds of years or if it was always here.
Are there any other questions? Online? In here? No? Yeah, no, well, we'll give her a round of applause. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your obviously your knowledge and your enthusiasm for your topic speaks very well. That was a great presentation and we very much appreciated it. Thank you, Kendra.
Thank you very much for your patience as I've kind of carried on about all of that. I could talk about them for days, but
No, that was great. Much appreciated. We had a train go by too. Maybe you didn't hear it.
Oh, did you? No, I didn't hear it.
It sounded like it was going to come right through the building. And people in Fredericton, I'm glad you were able to join us, and that was wonderful. And Ian, I hope you're still there, because I would like to thank you publicly for your help in this research I'm doing for the history of the club. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Ian was involved in our club, the 1970s, so 50 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, so we appreciate him as a resource. Sorry? And, sorry. Yeah, his father was a great naturalist, and Ian tagged along in the coattails for a while and then became very involved. Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was
We'll
great.
see you all again, I hope sometime. Okay, I hate to hit this button, but I guess I got to do it.
All right. Bye.
Bye.